Did Hollywood cross the line with World War II propaganda? Before Tom Hanks stormed Omaha Beach, classic filmmakers gambled their careers on war stories so shocking that theaters refused to show them. While D-Day thrilled modern audiences, these 15 forgotten classics sparked riots, ruined careers, and rewrote history itself. 1. The Great Dictator. 1940, Charlie Chaplin mocked Hitler while bombs still fell on London, gambling his entire career on a film Hollywood begged him not to make. This audacious satire arrived when America remained neutral and major studios still courted Nazi Germany for business. United Artists executives reportedly offered Chaplin $2 million, an astronomical sum in 1940, to abandon the project, fearing international repercussions. The film's Jewish barber character confused censors who couldn't decide if it was brave commentary or inappropriate comedy during wartime tragedy. Chaplin later admitted, "Had I known of the actual horrors, I could not have made jokes about any dictator." This admission came after Chaplin viewed footage from liberated concentration camps, an experience that reportedly left him unable to speak for several days. The final speech still echoes today, a 5-minute unbroken monologue where Chaplin steps entirely out of character to deliver what critics called the most dangerous political statement ever filmed. The speech required 102 takes over 6 days of shooting because Chaplin repeatedly broke down emotionally while delivering it. Germany banned the film, Britain initially hesitated to screen it, and it remained prohibited in Spain until Franco's death in 1975. When finally shown in West Germany in 1958, theaters reported multiple protesters outside claiming the film reopened wounds Germans were trying to heal. Despite earning 5 Oscar nominations, the film triggered an FBI investigation into Chaplin himself, with J. Edgar Hoover labeling him dangerous propaganda. FBI memos uncovered decades later reveal agents were instructed to find any evidence of communist sympathies in Chaplin's personal and professional life. Years later, Chaplin was denied re-entry to America after a European trip, effectively ending his Hollywood career. Upon receiving an honorary Oscar in 1972, Chaplin remarked, "They didn't ban my films because they were bad, they banned them because they were afraid." 2. Objective Burma. 1945. Errol Flynn stormed through Burma with such American bravado that the British government formally protested the film to President Truman. Warner Brothers pulled this inflammatory action epic from UK theaters after just 1 week when British veterans rioted outside cinemas, breaking windows and burning promotional materials. The controversy became so heated that Winston Churchill reportedly called it an example of how Americans plan to rewrite the war before it's even over. Director Raoul Walsh filmed soldiers parachuting into real jungle terrain without safety equipment, resulting in broken bones and near-fatal injuries. 3 stuntmen were hospitalized after a jump scene went catastrophically wrong, with 1 man impaled on a concealed branch. Studio executives demanded reshoots with safer conditions, but Walsh allegedly threatened to quit if forced to make war look pretty. Actor Errol Flynn later wrote in his autobiography that Walsh seemed more interested in creating real danger than in making a movie, and claimed the director deliberately agitated poisonous snakes before certain scenes to create authentic fear in the actors. The controversy centered on the film's complete erasure of British and Commonwealth forces who fought the actual Burma campaign, where over 40,000 British and Indian soldiers died. British Field Marshal Slim called it an insult to every soldier who served in Burma, while Winston Churchill reportedly walked out of a private screening, muttering preposterous fiction as he left. Australian Prime Minister John Curtin issued a formal complaint noting that Flynn, himself Australian-born, was portraying an American, while his countrymen who actually fought in Burma were erased entirely. Warner Brothers lost approximately $1.2 million in potential UK revenue before finally releasing a heavily edited version in 1952 with an apologetic prologue acknowledging British contributions. The studio required director Walsh to personally apologize to multiple veterans organizations before allowing him to direct another war film. Flynn, whose action hero image suffered significantly, later called it the most embarrassing episode of my professional life and claimed he hadn't realized how historically inaccurate the script was during production. The controversy permanently altered Hollywood's approach to depicting Allied contributions, with studios establishing historical accuracy departments to avoid similar diplomatic incidents. 3. Casablanca, 1942. Hollywood's most beloved classic was nearly banned by government censors who called its political message dangerously sympathetic to resistance movements. The film entered production when America's neutrality policy strictly prohibited pro-intervention propaganda, forcing constant script changes. Producer Hal Wallace later revealed that government representatives visited the set almost daily, demanding alterations to dialogue that too forcefully advocated fighting fascism. The infamous La Marseillaise scene, where patrons drown out Nazi officers by singing the French national anthem, caused German officials to demand the film be pulled from production. German consul Georg Gissling, who maintained an office in Los Angeles until Pearl Harbor, threatened that all Warner Brothers films would be banned in territories controlled by the Reich if the scene remained. Studio head Jack Warner received multiple threats and was summoned to Washington to explain why his film should be allowed to continue. Warner later claimed he told officials, "If showing Americans standing up against Nazis is propaganda, then label me a propagandist and proud of it." Humphrey Bogart's iconic Rick Blaine character was denounced by isolationist senators as undermining American neutrality by choosing to join the fight against fascism. Senator Gerald Nye of North Dakota specifically named the film in congressional hearings about foreign influences corrupting American media. The film's original ending, showing Rick and Ilsa escaping together, was scrapped after government officials warned it would glorify characters who chose personal happiness over wartime duty. Writer Howard Koch later revealed that the famous Hill of Beans speech was added specifically to appease government concerns that the film promoted individualism over patriotic sacrifice. The final dialogue was rewritten 23 times to satisfy censors, with director Michael Curtis reportedly filming multiple versions of key scenes to have options in editing. Several theaters in states with strong isolationist movements refused to show it, while others reported protesters outside claiming the film would drag America into Europe's war. When the film won the Academy Award for Best Picture, isolationist newspaper publisher William Randolph Hearst denounced it as obvious war propaganda and forbade any mention of the film in his newspapers. Today's beloved classic was once derided as shameless warmongering disguised as entertainment. The film's troubled production ironically mirrored its story of refugees, as many cast members were themselves European exiles. Actor Conrad Veidt, who played Major Strasser, had fled Germany after being blacklisted by the Nazis for his anti-fascist views. Director Michael Curtis was Hungarian Jewish, while actors Paul Henreid, Peter Lorre, and Aziz Sakal had all escaped Nazi persecution. When Henreid and Veidt filmed scenes together, Curtis needed an interpreter since they refused to speak German on set, considering it the language of their oppressors. 4. 30 Seconds. Over Tokyo, 1944, MGM's unfiltered depiction of the Doolittle raid included scenes so graphic that military advisors threatened to pull support midway through filming. The military insisted on veto power over any scene showing American casualties, leading to bitter clashes with director Mervyn LeRoy, who told studio executives, "This raid cost American lives and blood, showing anything less dishonors the men who died." The standoff nearly caused production to shut down until Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle himself intervened, arguing that an honest film serves the war effort better than a sanitized one. The film broke Hollywood taboos by showing a pilot's leg amputation in clinical detail. The sequence lasted nearly 3 minutes, the longest medical procedure ever filmed for mainstream audiences at that time. Medical journals praised its accuracy, while military psychologists condemned it as potentially traumatizing for wounded veterans. Theater owners reported multiple viewers fainting during initial screenings, with one Michigan theater counting 37 medical incidents in a single weekend. The sequence was so realistic that several medical schools requested prints for training purposes, believing it superior to actual surgical films. Van Johnson portrayed Lieutenant Ted Lawson with such unflinching realism that Lawson's actual wife reportedly left a screening in tears, saying, "It wasn't like watching a movie, it was like reliving the worst day of my life." Several theaters installed special recovery areas for overwhelmed viewers, while others hired nurses to stand by during screenings. The New York Times called it perhaps too honest for civilian audiences, while military officials quietly used the film to prepare families of wounded servicemen for what they might encounter when their loved ones returned home. Most controversial was the film's portrayal of Japanese civilians helping downed American airmen, which government officials worried would humanize the enemy when anti-Japanese sentiment was being actively cultivated. These scenes were heavily edited after test audiences complained they were too sympathetic, with director LeRoy forced to add narration, emphasizing that such kindness was rare. The Office of War Information initially rated the film problematic for suggesting that ordinary Japanese citizens were not uniformly malevolent. The film became required viewing for American bomber crews despite military psychologists warning it might induce anxiety among pilots facing similar missions. Navigator Robert Clever of the 94th Bomber Group later wrote, "After seeing that film, we knew exactly what awaited us if we went down. Not the fantasy of a clean hero's death, but the reality of blood, pain, and mutilation." 5. The Best Years of Our Lives. 1946. Director William Wyler stunned audiences by casting real amputee veteran Harold Russell, who lost both hands in training, then filmed him removing his prosthetic hooks on camera. Studio executives fought to replace him with an actor wearing fake prosthetics, claiming audiences would be disgusted by authentic disability on screen. Producer Samuel Goldwyn reportedly told Wyler, "No one wants to see the real cost of war when they're trying to forget it happened." Wyler, who had served as a documentary filmmaker with the Army Air Forces, responded by threatening to quit, saying, "If we're too delicate to look at our veterans, we shouldn't have sent them to war." The film provoked outrage by showing a decorated veteran reduced to working as a soda jerk after returning home. This portrayal directly contradicted government assurances that the GI Bill would ensure prosperity for all returning servicemen. Veterans organizations praised this honesty, while government officials condemned it as harmful to morale and potentially inciting unrest among returning servicemen. The American Legion initially criticized the film before abruptly reversing position after overwhelming positive response from its members, many of whom recognized their own struggles on screen. Perhaps most shocking was the film's unflinching look at PTSD, then called shell shock, and widely considered a form of weakness or cowardice. Frederick March's character suffers recurring nightmares and anxiety attacks that drive him to alcoholism, conditions military psychiatrists of the era often dismissed as lack of moral fiber. The American Psychiatric Association criticized the portrayal as dangerously normalizing, while military advisors called it an insult to the mental fortitude of American soldiers. Several prominent psychiatrists published a joint statement warning that the film might encourage veterans to indulge in self-pity rather than readjust to civilian life. The marriage breakdown subplot triggered protests from religious groups who insisted that suggesting war destroys families undermines the institution of marriage when stability is most needed. The Catholic Legion of Decency initially rated the film morally objectionable in part, specifically citing scenes where Dana Andrews' character contemplates divorce. The National Association of Family Life Organizations claimed the film would increase divorce rates among veterans by suggesting marital problems were common after service. Despite winning 7 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, several theater chains refused to show it, calling it anti-American propaganda disguised as sympathy. Decades later, veterans organizations would cite the film as the first honest portrayal of post-service challenges, with the Veterans Administration eventually using clips in counselor training programs. 6. From Here to Eternity, 1953, Columbia Pictures shocked America by portraying U.S. Army leadership as corrupt, violent, and morally bankrupt just 8 years after World War II ended. Based on James Jones's controversial novel, the film version was forced to eliminate or soften numerous elements including prostitution, homosexuality, and the most graphic violence. Even in its censored form, the Army initially refused any cooperation, calling the script a deliberate attempt to undermine military authority and recruitment efforts. General Matthew Ridgway personally reviewed the script and reportedly told Columbia executives, "This film will cost American lives by discouraging enlistment during the Korean conflict." The infamous beach scene between Burt Lancaster and Deborah Kerr broke censorship boundaries for suggesting adultery without condemning it. Religious organizations called for a nationwide boycott, while women's groups praised it for finally showing female desire honestly. The Catholic Legion of Decency condemned the film, placing it on their morally objectionable list and forbidding viewing by members. Several theater chains in the South and Midwest refused to show the film, with one owner in Kansas stating, "This film undermines the moral fabric our boys fought to protect." The scene was so controversial that both actors reported receiving hate mail for years afterward, with Lancaster claiming he lost roles because producers considered him morally tainted. The film's most controversial element was a suggestion that military incompetence contributed to losses at Pearl Harbor. Several congressmen demanded the film be investigated for un-American content, with Representative Harold Veldey of Illinois submitting a formal inquiry to the House Un-American Activities Committee. Pearl Harbor survivors were divided, some praising its honesty, others condemning it as exploitation. Admiral Husband Kimmel, who commanded the Pacific Fleet during the attack and was subsequently relieved of duty, threatened legal action, claiming the film perpetuated historical untruths to shift blame to military leadership. Columbia Pictures received so many protests that security was doubled at their offices, with executives reportedly receiving death threats. Director Fred Zinnemann fought bitter battles with the production code office over scenes showing military brutality. The boxing sequence where a soldier dies during a rigged match was nearly cut entirely after military officials called it a fabrication designed to slander the armed forces. Zinnemann countered by producing affidavits from former soldiers testifying to similar incidents. Actor Montgomery Clift, who portrayed the doomed Private Prewitt, received coaching from actual soldiers court-martialed for refusing to participate in boxing competitions. Despite these controversies, or perhaps because of them, the film grossed over $30 million against a $2 million budget and won 8 Academy Awards. Military historian Stephen Ambrose later noted that, more than any other film from here to eternity, permanently altered America's previously untouchable perception of its military leadership. 7. Stalag. 1953. Billy Wilder enraged patriotic sensibilities by showing American POWs as flawed, suspicious, and willing to brutally beat a fellow prisoner they wrongly suspect of collaboration. The American Legion condemned the film for tarnishing the image of our brave POWs and organized protests at theaters nationwide. Former POWs themselves were deeply divided, with some praising the film's psychological realism, while others called it a betrayal of the brotherhood we formed in captivity. One veterans organization collected over 50,000 signatures on a petition demanding the film be withdrawn, claiming it dishonored the memory of those who died in German camps. The controversial character of the German camp commandant, portrayed by Otto Preminger, was criticized for being too human and not villainous enough. Wilder, himself a Jewish refugee who lost family in the Holocaust, defended this choice, saying, "Evil looks ordinary, that's what makes it dangerous." In a particularly pointed response to critics, Wilder noted, "I was in Berlin when Hitler took power. He didn't look like a movie villain either." Preminger received hate mail accusing him of being sympathetic to Nazis, despite being a Jewish refugee himself who had fled Austria after the Anschluss. The portrayal was especially controversial, coming just 8 years after the war, when American audiences expected German characters to be unambiguously monstrous. William Holden's Oscar-winning performance as cynical black marketeer Sefton infuriated war veterans, who claimed it portrayed American prisoners as selfish opportunists rather than patriotic resistors. Holden received hate mail from former POWs, while others praised him for showing the psychological reality of captivity. The actor later revealed that during a promotional tour, a former prisoner physically confronted him, saying, "How dare you suggest we were anything but heroes every minute of every day." Major veterans publications condemned Holden's character as un-American and an insult to every man who endured captivity. 8. Paths of Glory. 1957. Stanley Kubrick's brutal anti-war statement was banned in France for nearly 20 years for suggesting French generals sacrifice their own men to advance their careers. The French government formally protested to United Artists, claiming the film deliberately insulted the honor of the French army and threatening economic sanctions against the studio's European operations. French Ambassador Hervé Alphonse personally contacted Motion Picture Association President Eric Johnston, warning that all United Artists films might be banned from France if the film was released. The film was eventually shown in France only in 1975, with the disclaimer that it was fiction and not based on actual incidents, despite being adapted from a novel inspired by real executions of French soldiers during World War I. The execution sequence was filmed with such unflinching realism that several crew members reportedly vomited during shooting. Kubrick insisted on multiple takes of soldiers being tied to posts and shot, despite actor Kirk Douglas begging him to stop after seeing extras breaking down emotionally. Douglas, whose production company financed the film, later wrote that Kubrick seemed possessed during those scenes, demanding take after take as if trying to break down not just the characters but the actors themselves. The scene was so disturbing that United Artists executives initially refused to include it, prompting Kubrick to threaten withdrawal from his contract. When questioned about the sequence's brutality, Kubrick reportedly responded, "If watching an execution disturbs you, perhaps you should question the act itself rather than its portrayal." Military consultants quit mid-production, calling the script dangerous propaganda that undermines necessary military discipline. One retired general told the press the film gives aid and comfort to the enemy by suggesting Western armies execute their own men. Theater owners in military towns refused to screen it after receiving threats from local commanders that they would discourage personnel from patronizing any business that showed the film. Several major theater chains refused to book the film, with one executive telling United Artists, quote, "We're not going to show a film that makes American boys think their officers might murder them." 9. Bridge on the River Kwai, 1957. Director David Lean faced accusations of treason for portraying a British officer collaborating with Japanese captors to build a railway bridge. Real survivors of the Burma Railway called the film a grotesque insult to the 13,000 Allied POWs who died during construction. The Far Eastern Prisoners of War Association, FEPOW, organized protests at London theaters, distributing pamphlets detailing the actual conditions of captivity that they felt the film sanitized. Former prisoner Alistair Urquhart, who survived both a railway and a torpedoed transport ship, called the film a dangerous fiction that makes the world forget what really happened to us. The British War Office initially refused any cooperation, stating the film glorified surrender and collaboration. War Minister John Hare publicly criticized Columbia Pictures, saying the film undermines the heroism of those who actively resisted their captors. Veterans organizations threatened to picket theaters, forcing Columbia Pictures to add a disclaimer distancing the story from actual events. This disclaimer, which acknowledged the film was fiction, was considered insufficient by many veterans who felt audiences would nonetheless perceive it as historically accurate. Alec Guinness's portrayal of Colonel Nicholson was condemned by military officials as psychologically impossible for a British officer. The character's gradual transition from resistance to pride in the bridge's construction was described by one retired general as an obscene misrepresentation of how officers behaved in captivity. Former POWs were divided, some praising the film for showing the complex reality of captivity, others claiming it romanticized their torment for entertainment. Guinness himself expressed discomfort with the role, later writing that he received disturbing letters from men who had survived the railway, some supporting my portrayal, others expressing profound hurt. 10. The Young Lions, 1958. Casting beloved American star Marlon Brando as a Nazi officer triggered nationwide outrage, with Jewish organizations leading protests outside theaters. The Anti-Defamation League expressed grave concerns about humanizing Nazi characters so soon after the Holocaust, while veterans groups called for a boycott of the film. Brando received death threats, while director Edward Dmytryk was denounced as sympathetic to fascism, despite being a Jewish filmmaker who had been blacklisted during the McCarthy era for refusing to testify before the House Un-American Activities Committee. The film broke Hollywood taboos by portraying a German soldier as a complex human rather than a one-dimensional villain. Brando's character questions Nazi ideology and ultimately dies disillusioned with Hitler's Germany, a portrayal veterans groups called dangerous revisionism that excuses German atrocities. Rabbi Abraham Feldman of Hartford, Connecticut, organized a campaign against the film, stating, "To humanize those who participated in genocide, regardless of their personal feelings, is to begin the process of forgetting what must never be forgotten." Brando defended his portrayal, arguing, "Understanding how ordinary Germans became complicit doesn't excuse their actions. It helps prevent such horrors from happening again." Most controversial was the film's parallel structure suggesting moral equivalence between American and German soldiers. The American Jewish Congress called this approach morally reprehensible, while the film's screenwriter defended it as necessary to understand how ordinary Germans became complicit. One particularly controversial scene showed Brando's character rescuing a Jewish girl from other Nazi soldiers, which critics claim promoted the myth of the good German that obscured collective responsibility for the Holocaust. Screenwriter Irwin Shaw, who adapted his own novel, argued that showing a German with moral qualms doesn't deny Nazi atrocities, it makes them more horrifying by showing they were committed by humans, not monsters. Theater chains in heavily Jewish neighborhoods initially refused to screen it, while others reported protesters distributing pamphlets claiming the film whitewashed Nazi crimes. 20th Century Fox executives received so many threats that they hired additional security for the premiere. Despite the controversy, the film performed well commercially and earned critical praise for its nuanced approach to enemy soldiers. Film historian Robert Sklar later noted that The Young Lions marked the moment when American cinema began the difficult process of understanding World War II as a human tragedy rather than simply a moral crusade. The film also sparked important debates about whether humanizing Nazi characters constituted historical revisionism or necessary historical understanding, with these arguments presaging later controversies around films like Downfall and Das Boot. 11. Hell is for Heroes, 1962. Don Siegel's grim combat film shocked audiences with its portrayal of American soldiers as exhausted, resentful, and morally compromised. The military withdrew support mid-production after reading scenes where soldiers openly question orders and express contempt for leadership. General Maxwell Taylor reportedly told Pentagon officials, "This film will undo a decade of recruitment efforts," while the Department of Defense issued a rare public statement distancing itself from the production. Studio executives pressured Siegel to adopt a more patriotic tone, but the director refused, saying, "The men who actually fought this war deserve better than candy-coated lies." Steve McQueen's character sparked controversy by suggesting combat addiction, a soldier who functions better in war than peace. Veterans organizations condemned this portrayal as glamorizing psychological damage, while military recruiters claimed it would discourage enlistment. Psychology Today published an article questioning whether the film promoted dangerous misconceptions about combat psychology, while several military chaplains organized a campaign against it, calling McQueen's character morally corrupting to young viewers. McQueen defended his portrayal, stating, "I've talked to enough combat veterans to know this type exists, men who find purpose in war they can't find at home." The film's most controversial sequence showed American soldiers using the body of a dead German as bait in a trap. This scene prompted walkouts during test screenings, with audience members calling it ghoulish and un-American. Paramount executives demanded it be cut, but Siegel threatened to remove his name from the film if forced to do so. The director defended the scene by producing letters from combat veterans describing similar tactics, arguing, "War makes men do terrible things for survival. Hiding that fact doesn't honor anyone." The American Legion condemned the scene as portraying American heroes as no better than the enemy, while several veteran combat journalists acknowledged such incidents occurred but questioned whether depicting them served any purpose beyond sensation. 12. The Dirty Dozen, 1967. MGM shocked audiences with a premise suggesting convicted murderers and rapists could become military heroes. Veterans organizations condemned the film as insulting to the real soldiers who fought honorably, while military officials called it a deliberate attempt to tarnish the reputation of Special Operations Forces. The veterans of foreign wars issued a formal statement calling the film an affront to every man who served, while several newspapers published editorials questioning whether the film violated the military's posthumous dignity. Director Robert Aldrich received thousands of angry letters, many from veterans' families asking, "Is this how you think my father, brother, or son won the war? As a criminal?" The film's unprecedented violence pushed censorship boundaries, particularly the finale where German officers and their companions are burned alive in a bunker. This sequence required multiple submissions to the ratings board before approval, with MGM ultimately agreeing to reduce the screams of burning victims to secure a rating. British censors demanded 28 cuts before allowing its release, while American critics called it depraved and sadistic entertainment masquerading as historical drama. Religious organizations were particularly outraged by the bunker sequence, with the Catholic Legion of Decency condemning the film for finding entertainment value in human suffering. Aldrich defended the scene, arguing, "The real burning of Dresden killed 25,000 civilians. My fictional scene shows a dozen Nazi officers dying while plotting war crimes, which is really more disturbing." Director Robert Aldrich faced accusations of glorifying criminals and suggesting military incompetence through the character of the aristocratic Colonel Breed, portrayed as more dangerous than the convicts. Several retired generals publicly condemned the film as leftist propaganda designed to undermine respect for military leadership at a time when our boys are fighting in Vietnam. The Pentagon issued an internal memo warning that the film promotes dangerously anti-authoritarian attitudes and discouraged base theaters from showing it. Aldrich was unapologetic, later stating, "If military leadership is so fragile that a movie can undermine it, perhaps the problem isn't with Hollywood." 13. The Clock, 1945. Vincente Minnelli's quiet masterpiece caused uproar by suggesting a whirlwind wartime marriage might be a mistake. Military chaplains condemned the film as undermining the morale of servicemen by questioning the validity of war marriages. Army chaplain Major William Douglas published an open letter calling the film destructive to military families, while several religious organizations organized letter-writing campaigns to MGM. The studio received over 20,000 letters of protest before release, with many threatening boycotts if the film wasn't altered to more enthusiastically endorse rapid wartime marriages. The film broke taboos by portraying a soldier spending his last leave seeking romance rather than displaying patriotic fervor. Several military newspapers refused to accept advertisements for the film, claiming it portrayed servicemen as more interested in pursuing women than serving their country. Women's organizations were divided, some praising its honest portrayal of wartime relationships, others condemning it as encouraging promiscuity among military wives. The Women's Christian Temperance Union called the film morally dangerous at a time when young women need guidance, not encouragement to make impulsive decisions. Most controversial was the film's suggestion that war corrupts even love itself by forcing hasty commitments. The scene where the couple struggles to find someone to marry them was criticized by religious leaders as mocking the sanctity of marriage by portraying it as a bureaucratic hurdle rather than a sacred commitment. Religious leaders called this theme dangerously cynical, while government officials worried it would discourage the stable family formations necessary for post-war prosperity. The Office of War Information, which reviewed scripts for their potential impact on morale, initially rated the film problematic and suggested significant revisions to make the marriage appear more clearly positive and sustainable. MGM received so many complaints from military bases that they considered shelving the film entirely. Soldiers' wives were particularly vocal critics, with one women's auxiliary group calling it an insult to every woman who married her sweetheart before deployment. Director Minnelli fought back, arguing that showing the human cost of war was inherently patriotic. In a letter to studio head Louis B. Mayer, Minnelli wrote, "This film honors the difficult choices war forces on ordinary people, pretending these choices are easy dishonors those making them." The studio ultimately released it with minimal promotion, expecting failure only to see it become a surprise hit with war-weary audiences seeking emotional honesty rather than combat spectacle. Decades later, film historian Mark Harris would note that the clock dared to suggest that the emotional casualties of war extended far beyond the battlefield, affecting even the most intimate human relationships. 14. They Were Expendable, 1945. John Ford's unflinching portrayal of American defeat in the Philippines was initially suppressed by military censors who claimed it would damage morale by showing retreat. The Navy demanded extensive cuts to scenes showing American forces overwhelmed by Japanese attacks, with one admiral reportedly telling Ford, "Americans need to see victories, not disasters." Ford, who had filmed actual combat footage at Midway as a Naval Reserve commander, refused to make the cuts, arguing that honoring the men who fought in the Philippines required showing their actual experiences rather than a sanitized version. The film broke wartime taboos by showing high-ranking officers evacuated while ordinary sailors were left behind, what one admiral called unnecessarily highlighting difficult command decisions. The scene showing General MacArthur leaving was particularly controversial, with the War Department requesting it be removed entirely as potentially damaging to the general's public image. Several naval officials threatened to denounce the film publicly if these scenes weren't modified, claiming they created a dangerous misimpression of military decision-making. Ford refused, stating, "These men were ordered to stay behind. The least we can do is acknowledge that fact." Most controversial was the film's title itself, suggesting American servicemen were considered disposable by leadership. This phrase, taken from an actual military communique, infuriated Pentagon officials who claimed it was taken out of context and inflammatory. Veterans of the Philippine campaign were divided, some grateful for acknowledgement of their sacrifice, others angry at what they saw as exploitation of their suffering for entertainment. One survivors' organization called the film a painful reminder of abandonment, while others praised it for finally telling the truth about what we endured. Director Ford, himself a Naval Reserve officer who filmed actual combat footage at Midway, fought bitterly with censors, claiming, "This happened to real men while Hollywood was making musicals." When an admiral suggested toning down scenes of defeat, Ford reportedly responded, "I've seen men die under enemy fire. What's your expertise in this matter?" The film's release was delayed until after VJ Day, when censors worried less about morale, but it still faced criticism for focusing on defeat when America should be celebrating victory. Despite these controversies, the film was embraced by many veterans who felt their early war sacrifices had been overshadowed by later victories. Historian Paul Fussell later noted, "They Were Expendable marked the beginning of a more honest cinematic accounting of the war, acknowledging that America's path to victory began with disastrous defeats that cost thousands of lives." 15. So Proudly We Hail, 1943. Paramount's portrayal of Army nurses in the Philippines provoked military outrage by showing women experiencing combat trauma. The scene where Nurse Lieutenant Olivia Darcy, Veronica Lake, suffers a breakdown after her fiancé's death, violated military guidelines against showing psychological instability in service personnel. Military psychiatrists complained the film would normalize hysteria among female personnel and undermine confidence in women's ability to serve. Several military nursing corps leaders protested directly to Paramount, claiming the film would damage recruitment efforts at a time when nurses were desperately needed. The film's most shocking scene showed Nurse Lieutenant Rosemary Larson wrapping grenades in her clothing and sacrificing herself to kill Japanese soldiers approaching their position. Military censors demanded the scene be cut, claiming it was too disturbing for wartime audiences and suggested American women face combat situations. The War Department officially objected to this sequence, stating that it blurred the appropriate roles of women in wartime and might cause unnecessary anxiety among families of deployed nurses. Director Mark Sandrich defended the scene by producing accounts of similar incidents from Bataan, arguing that denying the reality of women's sacrifices dishonors their service. Director Mark Sandrich fought battles with the Hayes office over scenes showing nurses discussing relationships with men, which censors called inappropriate conversation for military women. One censor's note complained that professional women in uniform should not be portrayed discussing romantic matters, suggesting such scenes undermine the dignity of the nursing corps. Paramount received complaints from religious organizations claiming the film encouraged improper fraternization in wartime. The Catholic Legion of Decency objected to scenes implying romantic relationships between unmarried personnel, calling them morally problematic despite their historical accuracy. Perhaps most controversial was the film's unflinching portrayal of the fall of Bataan and Corregidor when most war films focused exclusively on Allied victories. The sequence showing the evacuation of wounded men while others were left behind particularly disturbed military officials who worried it would remind the public of defeats rather than inspiring confidence. Government officials worried it would discourage public morale at a critical time, with one War Department memo suggesting the film dwelled unnecessarily on American losses. Despite these controversies, the film was embraced by many actual military nurses who called it the first honest portrayal of what we endured. Nurse Corps Captain Juanita Hamilton wrote to Paramount, "Thank you for showing that women too faced danger, made sacrifices, and suffered trauma. Our service was different from men's, but no less valuable or costly." What classic war film pushed your boundaries too far? Did Hollywood sanitize World War II or exploit its horrors? The films you've just explored transformed how we remember history itself, yet most were hidden away after their controversial debuts. Next time you watch a modern war blockbuster, ask yourself, are we finally ready for the unvarnished truth about the good war, or do we still need comforting lies about the greatest generation? Let us know in the comments which of these controversial classics deserves a modern reappraisal or should remain buried in film history.